The text message buzzed on Chloe's phone, and she felt her stomach tighten as she read the words. I'm about to go bankrupt. Sell your apartment to pay my debts. She stared at the screen, her mind racing, trying to process what she had just read. This wasn't the first time her brother had asked for money, but the urgency in his words felt different. He had always relied on her, his older sister, the one who had it all together, the one who always came through when things got rough. But this was too much. She wasn't a bank, she wasn't his personal ATM, and she was done being the family's safety net. She took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Her brother's text felt like a punch to the gut. She knew this wasn't just about the restaurant. This was about the years of emotional manipulation, the countless times he'd asked for help and Chloe had given in. But not this time. Not anymore. With a quick movement, she typed out a single word and hit send. No. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from her mother. Sign a $200,000 loan for your brother or you're no longer family. The words hit Chloe like a slap to the face. Her mother had always found ways to manipulate her, but this time, the ultimatum felt like the breaking point. Chloe's fingers shook as she set the phone down, staring at the message. She could feel the weight of it, the pull of guilt, but there was no going back now. Chloe Bennett, 28 years old, sat in her apartment in Berlin, staring out the window at the city she had come to love. Her life here was so different from what she had left behind in the United States, more peaceful, more hers. She had worked hard to build a career in tech, and though her job had initially been a means to an end, it had now become the anchor she needed to start fresh. For the first time in years, she wasn't responsible for anyone but herself. The weight of her family's demands, the constant feeling of being the one who had to solve everyone else's problems, was a thing of the past. But as Chloe sipped her coffee and looked out at the skyline, her phone buzzed again. Another text from her mother. Chloe stared at the screen for a moment before setting the phone aside. The flood of messages from her family over the past few weeks had become unbearable. Her brother's text about the restaurant, her mother's threats and guilt trips, it was like they were trying to drag her back into the life she'd fought so hard to escape. She tried to focus on the city around her. Berlin had been the escape she needed. She remembered the long, exhausting nights working in New York, where she had been the go-to person for everyone, solving problems she hadn't created, paying bills that weren't hers. And all the while, her family had treated her like a constant source of support, never once stopping to ask if she needed help or if she was okay. But now, everything was different. Here, in this new chapter of her life, Chloe had no intention of going back to the person she had been. She had given her family everything, and they still wanted more. They didn't appreciate what she had done for them, didn't see the sacrifices she had made. All they saw was someone they could lean on whenever they needed something, and it had drained her. As she looked out at the busy streets below, Chloe felt a surge of anger. Why had she allowed them to treat her like this for so long? Why had she let them take her for granted? The guilt that used to paralyze her was slowly being replaced by something else, something stronger, a sense of clarity. She had finally done something for herself, and the feeling was liberating. She had moved to Berlin to escape the grip her family had on her, and now she was finally living her own life. Chloe grabbed her phone and opened the message from her mother. She read it through once more, feeling her resolve strengthen. Sign the loan, or you're no longer family. The ultimatum felt harsh, but she wasn't scared anymore. She wasn't going to sign that loan. She wasn't going to keep playing the role they had assigned her, the responsible one, the problem solver, the money provider. It wasn't her job to fix everything for them. She had spent years cleaning up their messes, covering for their mistakes. And where had it gotten her? Nowhere. Her family had taken her for granted, and it was time to let go. She typed a quick response. I'm not coming back. I won't sign the loan. I've done enough. Chloe hit send and then set the phone down, letting out a deep breath. Her heart was racing, but she felt a quiet sense of peace. She had made her decision. She wasn't going to go back. Not for them, not for anyone. The phone buzzed again, and Chloe picked it up without thinking. It was another text from her brother, filled with anger and accusations. "You're choosing your life over your family. You'll regret this." Chloe didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had already made her choice. She stood up, walked to the window, and gazed out at the horizon. Berlin was her new beginning, and nothing, no message, no guilt trip, no threat, was going to take that away from her. Chloe spent the next few days in a whirlwind of emotions. Her phone remained silent, but she couldn't stop thinking about the messages from her family. The tension she had been feeling for years now seemed to bubble up to the surface. She had always been the reliable one, the one her family turned to when things went wrong, and it had worn her down in ways she never realized. She reflected on how many times she had put her own life on hold for them, from bailing her brother out of countless failed ventures to paying off her mother's debts. Every time she had hoped it would be the last, but it never was. Every time she'd say no, they would find a way to make her feel guilty, to make her feel like it was her responsibility to fix everything, and she always gave in because she loved them. Chloe sat at her kitchen table, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. She thought about the things she had missed out on, the trips she never took because her family needed her, the career opportunities she let pass because she had to be there for her brother when he was struggling again, the relationships she never pursued because her time was always spent taking care of everyone else. Chloe had sacrificed so much of herself over the years. And for what? So they could continue living their lives like nothing had changed? She stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the city. The skyline of Berlin was a reminder of everything she had fought for, everything she had gained since making the decision to leave. She had finally broken free from their grasp, but the guilt still lingered. She had a career here now, a future. But could she really let go of the family she had tried so hard to please? Could she live with the decision she had made? Chloe opened her phone and started scrolling through her contacts. She thought about calling her mother, asking if they could talk, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Not yet, maybe not ever. She was afraid that if she opened that door again, she would be dragged back into the same cycle of guilt and manipulation. The thought of her mother's voice pleading with her to come home made Chloe's chest tighten. She had heard it all before, and she had given in every single time. But now she knew better. She wasn't going to fix things for them anymore. She wasn't going to be the one to make everything okay. Chloe had spent her entire life being the problem solver, the one who had to make the tough decisions for everyone else, but not anymore. She was done. The next morning, Chloe received a text from her brother. The tone was far more aggressive than any of the previous ones. "You've abandoned us," it read. "I'm trying to keep this restaurant alive, and you're over there living your life while we fall apart. You owe me this. You're the only one who can help us." Chloe could almost hear the desperation in his words, but it didn't affect her the way it used to. She wasn't going to let him guilt trip her into helping him again. She set the phone down, breathing in deeply. There it was again, the same pattern. He wasn't asking for help. He was demanding it. He was treating her like she was still the person who had to fix his mistakes, who had to clean up his mess. But she wasn't that person anymore. She knew the consequences of her actions. She knew that by refusing to help him, by cutting herself off from her family, she was making an irreversible choice. But Chloe didn't feel fear or regret. She felt something else. Relief. She was finally choosing herself. She was finally going to live for her own happiness, not for the people who had taken her for granted. As she sat back in her chair, Chloe thought about her father. She had always been close to him, and the thought of him struggling without her support hit her harder than she expected. But she couldn't let herself get pulled back in. She couldn't keep sacrificing herself for people who didn't appreciate her. Her father had his own life to live, and her mother and brother had to learn to take responsibility for their own actions. Chloe reached for her phone and typed a response to her brother. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you. I've done enough. It's time for you to figure this out on your own." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The moment she sent the message, Chloe felt the weight of years of emotional baggage lift off her shoulders. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right one. She couldn't keep sacrificing her future for people who refused to take responsibility for their own actions. Chloe stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow across the buildings. She had made her choice, and it felt like the first step toward true freedom. The phone buzzed again, and Chloe picked it up. It was a message from her mother, filled with anger and disappointment. Chloe read it, but she didn't let it affect her. She put the phone down and walked away from it. She had made her decision. Her future was hers to shape now, and no one could take that away from her. Chloe didn't know what to expect when she made the decision to cut ties with her family, but as the days passed, the weight of her choice settled heavily on her shoulders. It wasn't that she regretted it, but the silence from her family was deafening. They had always been a constant in her life, and now, with her decision to walk away, she felt more isolated than ever. She was no longer the daughter, the sister, the person they relied on. She was simply Chloe, and that, more than anything, made her feel both liberated and uneasy. The silence was broken when Chloe's brother sent another message. This one was short, cold, and to the point. "You've made your choice." There was no anger, no pleading, just a sharp finality that made Chloe's stomach churn. It was as if he had already written her off, as if the decision was already made for her. The message hit harder than she expected. She sat on her bed, staring at her phone for a few minutes, contemplating whether to respond. But she knew deep down that there was nothing left to say. Her brother's text had confirmed something she'd known for years. No matter what she did, no matter how much she gave, it would never be enough. He would never appreciate her sacrifices. They were just a given. Chloe had always been the reliable one, the one who fixed things, but every time she gave a part of herself, it only made her feel more hollow. Now, sitting in her Berlin apartment, she finally realized that she had been living someone else's life for far too long. Chloe tried to push the thoughts aside as she made her way to work, but the familiar weight of guilt followed her throughout the day. She tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but her mind kept drifting back to her family. Could she have handled it differently? Was there any way to help without compromising herself? She pushed the thoughts away and focused on the present, but deep down, Chloe knew that her life had shifted irreparably. By the time she finished her work for the day, Chloe had convinced herself that she had made the right choice. She knew she couldn't keep enabling her family, especially when it meant sacrificing her own happiness. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text from her mother. Chloe hesitated, knowing that this message wouldn't be any better than the last one from her brother. She opened it and read the words slowly. "You've turned your back on us. I don't know how you can live with yourself." The message stung, but Chloe didn't let it stop her. She didn't respond right away. But as she sat in the quiet of her apartment, she realized that these words, though painful, were part of the price she would have to pay for her freedom. Her mother's disappointment wasn't hers to carry anymore. She wasn't a failure for choosing herself. She was finally starting to live for Chloe, not for anyone else's expectations. That night, after dinner, Chloe sat on her balcony with a glass of wine in hand, looking out over the city. Berlin, with its vibrancy and possibilities, had become a symbol of the life she was slowly building. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. It was the life she had chosen for herself. Chloe had taken a leap, and though she still faced moments of doubt, she knew she had made the right choice. She wasn't running away from her family. She was running toward something better. The phone buzzed again, and this time it was a call from her mother. Chloe stared at the screen, her finger hovering over the green button. For a moment, she thought about answering. Maybe they could talk. Maybe they could understand why she made the decision she did. But then, just as quickly, she remembered everything. The years of giving, the constant manipulation, the guilt trips. She didn't owe them anything. Chloe put her phone down, the call unanswered, and sat back in her chair. The tension in her chest, the one that had been there for as long as she could remember, started to loosen. She was learning to breathe again. She had chosen herself, and it felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The next few days were quieter. Her brother and mother had stopped texting, and Chloe, for the first time in a long time, felt like she could hear her own thoughts without their voices echoing in her head. She focused on her job, met a few new people, and explored the city. The loneliness that once consumed her didn't feel as heavy. She had her own space now, and she was starting to fill it with things that made her happy. Things that were just for her. But as the week went on, Chloe received another message from her brother. It was a voicemail, and as she played it, she heard his voice crack with emotion. "I don't understand why you're doing this. We're family. How could you just leave us like this? I thought you cared." Chloe felt a brief wave of guilt, but this time it didn't overwhelm her. She had already heard these words before, and she knew they were part of the pattern. The guilt was a weapon, and she wasn't going to let it control her anymore. Instead of responding to the message, Chloe went for a long walk through the city. As she walked, she felt the weight of the past few months lift from her shoulders. She had done what she needed to do. She had freed herself from the hold her family had on her. Chloe didn't need their approval to move forward, and that was the greatest freedom of all. As she reached the edge of a park, Chloe stopped and took a deep breath, looking around at the life she was building. It was messy, uncertain, and yet it was hers. And for the first time in a long time, she was beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, it was enough. Chloe's world was shaken when she received a surprise email from her brother. It came at an unexpected time, and as soon as she saw his name, she knew something was wrong. The subject line read, "Please, Chloe, I need you." Her heart sank as she clicked on it, knowing that his desperation would bleed through the screen. The email was full of pleading, accusations, and guilt. Her brother admitted that the restaurant was now in complete financial ruin. His tone was filled with panic and frustration, and he made it clear that he had nowhere else to turn. He begged Chloe to come back, even offering to pay her back in the future. The email ended with a final line that tugged at her heart. "You're the only one who can help us. Please, I can't do this without you." Chloe stared at the screen, her mind racing. Her first instinct was to pick up the phone, call him, and make everything better. She had done it so many times before, after all. She had always been the one who swooped in to save him, to make everything okay. But this time, Chloe stopped herself. She took a deep breath and sat back in her chair. She knew the emotional manipulation, the guilt, the constant expectation that she would be the one to fix things. She'd been there before. She had helped him time and time again, only for him to end up in the same situation, asking for more. It was exhausting, and for the first time, Chloe realized she couldn't keep doing this. She closed the laptop and took a walk around her apartment. Berlin had started to feel like home, a place where she could breathe without feeling suffocated by the weight of others' expectations. The thought of returning to her old life, of getting sucked back into the chaos, made her stomach turn. Chloe had worked too hard to build this new life. She had fought to get here, to be independent, to escape the constant demands of her family, And now, here was her brother, pulling her back into the same old cycle. The more she thought about it, the more resolute she became. She wasn't going to fall into the trap again. She wasn't going to sacrifice her own future just to clean up his mess. She had already given him too much of herself. Later that evening, Chloe composed a reply to his email. She typed slowly, carefully choosing her words. She didn't want to be harsh, but she knew she couldn't sugarcoat her response. After a few minutes, she finished the email, her finger hovering over the send button. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure if she was making the right choice. But then, with a deep breath, she clicked send. "I can't help you this time," Chloe wrote. "I've done all I can, and you need to face the consequences of your own actions. I can't keep enabling this cycle. It's time for you to take responsibility for your own life." As soon as she hit send, Chloe felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It was done. She had made the decision, and there was no going back. She wasn't going to be the one who fixed everything anymore. The next morning, Chloe received a text from her mother. The message was brief but piercing. "Your brother is in trouble. Don't you care?" Chloe felt her stomach churn. The words were a direct shot to her heart, but she didn't let them take root. She had heard this all before, the guilt, the manipulation. She had been the responsible one for far too long. It was time for her mother and brother to face the consequences of their actions. Chloe had carried them long enough. She didn't respond to the text. Instead, she took her phone, set it down on the counter, and walked out of her apartment. She needed some air, some space to clear her mind. The sun was shining, the streets of Berlin bustling with life, and Chloe felt like she could finally breathe again. As she walked through the park, she realized something important. She was no longer living for anyone but herself. It wasn't selfish to put herself first. It was necessary. She had spent so many years running on empty, trying to make everyone else happy, that she had forgotten what it felt like to live for her own joy. Chloe knew her family wouldn't understand. They never did. But that was no longer her problem. She had a future to build, and it was hers to shape. The pressure, the guilt, and the manipulation, they couldn't control her anymore. When she returned to her apartment that evening, there were a few missed calls from her mother and brother, but Chloe didn't feel the familiar pull to answer. She was learning to let go. This was her life now, and she was ready to embrace it fully, without looking back. The next morning, as she sipped her coffee, Chloe felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had made the hardest decision of her life, but it was the right one. She wasn't responsible for her family's choices anymore. They had to find their own way, just as she was doing. Chloe knew the journey ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be moments of doubt, of second-guessing, and maybe even guilt. But she had made it this far, and she wasn't about to turn back. The future was waiting for her future, and she was ready to walk into it with her head held high. Chloe woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing on the bedside table. She groggily reached over to check the message, and the moment she saw her mother's name on the screen, she felt a tightening in her chest. It had been over a week since she sent her final email to her brother, and though the silence from her family had been a relief, it seemed that they were now trying to break that silence. Chloe hesitated before opening the message. She already knew it would be another attempt to pull her back in. The text from her mother read, "You've made a mistake, Chloe. Your brother's situation is getting worse. You're the only one who can help him now." Chloe's stomach churned as she read the words, but she didn't feel the usual wave of guilt that would normally sweep over her. This time, she felt anger instead, anger at how her family had always treated her like a resource, as if she were obligated to fix every problem they faced. She threw the phone down on the bed, frustrated and exhausted. It seemed like no matter how far she ran, they always found a way to reach her, to make her feel like she was failing them. but she knew now that it was their responsibility, not hers. She couldn't be the one to carry their burdens anymore. It was time for them to face the consequences of their actions, and Chloe couldn't keep enabling them. The next few hours were spent in a daze as Chloe tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to the text. She couldn't stop thinking about her mother's words. It hurt to know that her family was in pain, but the truth was, Chloe had been in pain for much longer. She had spent years trying to keep them afloat, trying to be the person who fixed everything, but all that did was drain her. She had nothing left to give. As the evening approached, Chloe decided to take a break and go for a walk. The cool Berlin air helped clear her mind, and as she strolled through the streets, she reflected on how much had changed in the months since she left the United States. She no longer felt trapped by the weight of her family's expectations. She was free, and the freedom felt like a breath of fresh air. But as she wandered further into the city, Chloe began to feel the familiar sting of doubt creeping in. Her family's words lingered in her mind, her mother's pleading, her brother's anger. She knew they were angry with her, and part of her missed the closeness they once had. But she also knew that going back to that life would mean giving up everything she had worked so hard to create. It would mean sacrificing her happiness again for the sake of their demands. She couldn't go back to that. The walk helped Chloe regain her clarity. She couldn't let the guilt control her anymore. She had made her decision, and it was final. She would not return to the United States, not to be their fixer, not to be their financial savior. She was building a life here, and that life was hers to live. When she returned to her apartment, Chloe decided to write one last message to her mother. She knew it might be the hardest thing she'd ever do, but she had to say it. She had to set her boundaries once and for all. Sitting at her desk, she took a deep breath and began to type. "Mom, I understand that things are hard right now, and I wish I could help, but I can't. I've done everything I can for you all, and now it's time for you to figure it out. I've made my decision, and I'm not coming back. I love you, but I can't sacrifice my own happiness and future for the same cycle of dependency. I need to live my own life, and I can't do that while being pulled back into this. Please understand." She read the message twice, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. There was no turning back now. With a heavy heart, Chloe hit send and pushed the phone away from her. She didn't need to see the response. She had made her choice, and no matter how hard it was the right one. Later that evening, Chloe received a notification, a missed call from her mother. She didn't bother to check the voicemail. Instead, she went to bed early, exhausted from the emotional toll the day had taken. As she lay in bed, she felt a quiet sense of relief washing over her. The weight she had been carrying for so long was finally starting to lift. The next morning, Chloe woke up to another text from her brother. This time, there were no demands, no guilt. Just a simple, hurtful message. "I guess you've chosen your life over us. I hope you're happy." Chloe's heart sank, but she didn't let it break her. This was his way of coping, his way of lashing out because she had finally stopped playing the role they had cast her in. Chloe didn't reply. She had nothing left to say. She got ready for work, determined not to let the message affect her. She had made a clean break, and she was going to stand by it. She couldn't keep living in a way that drained her. She couldn't keep sacrificing herself for people who didn't appreciate her. As she walked out the door, Chloe felt a newfound strength. The world was still uncertain, but for the first time in her life, she was in control of her own destiny, and that was enough. Chloe woke up to a quiet morning, the kind she had grown to cherish since moving to Berlin. The city outside her apartment was bustling with life, but within the walls of her own space, everything felt peaceful. For the first time in a long while, Chloe was able to breathe without the constant pressure of her family's expectations hanging over her. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, but now, in her new life, she could finally focus on herself. She had been in Berlin for over a month now, And though the adjustment had been difficult at times, Chloe was beginning to feel more at home. Her job was going well, and she had even started to make a few friends. She spent her days working, exploring the city, and taking time to care for herself in ways she never had before. But as she sat in her living room, sipping her coffee, Chloe couldn't ignore the nagging thought in the back of her mind. Her family hadn't contacted her since her last message, and while she had initially felt a sense of relief, the silence now felt heavy. The guilt from the way things ended with her mother and brother still weighed on her, even though she knew she had made the right decision. She was beginning to question if she had made a mistake by cutting them off so completely. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, and her heart dropped when she saw her mother's name. Chloe hesitated for a moment before unlocking her phone and opening the message. The text was simple, but it hit her harder than she expected. "Your father is getting worse. Please, Chloe, we need you." Chloe's breath caught in her throat. The last time she had spoken to her mother, she had made it clear that she wasn't coming back. And now, her mother was asking her to return for her father, who was sick. Chloe's chest tightened as the old patterns of guilt began to surface. She thought about her father, the man who had always supported her, even when her mother and brother hadn't. But she also remembered the years of sacrifice she had made for her family, the times she had given up her own dreams to solve their problems. She set the phone down, feeling overwhelmed. Chloe had made it clear that she was done being the family's financial and emotional savior. She had put her foot down, and yet here it was again, the call for her to drop everything and come back. Chloe stood up and walked over to the window. The cold air from outside made her shiver, but it also gave her a sense of clarity. She couldn't keep going back and forth. She couldn't allow herself to be dragged back into their chaos. She had worked so hard to create this new life, a life where she could finally be free from the endless cycle of guilt and responsibility. She wasn't going to give that up. For a moment, Chloe thought about the consequences. Her mother's disappointment, her brother's anger. She had already dealt with that. But the thought of her father sick and alone made her heart ache. She hadn't wanted to hurt anyone, but she had to protect herself. She couldn't live for her family's needs anymore. She had spent so many years doing that, and it had only drained her. Chloe took a deep breath and decided that she would not go back. Her father's illness, though heartbreaking, was not her responsibility to fix. She had done all she could for them, and it was time for her to focus on her own life, her own healing. As the day went on, Chloe tried to push the message out of her mind. She spent time in her favorite cafe, walking around the city and reading. But no matter how much she tried to distract herself, the guilt kept creeping back in. What if she was making the wrong decision? What if her family needed her and she wasn't there? What kind of daughter was she if she couldn't even support her father in his time of need? The thoughts were overwhelming, and for the first time since moving to Berlin, Chloe felt like she was slipping. She tried to shake it off, but the guilt continued to gnaw at her. By the evening, Chloe had made up her mind. She needed to face the situation head-on. It was time for a final decision, not just for her family, but for herself. She couldn't keep living in fear of their expectations, their guilt, or their manipulation. It was time to end the cycle. She would write a final message to her mother, explaining that she couldn't come back. Chloe sat down at her desk and began typing. "Mom, I know things are difficult right now, but I can't come back. I've already made my decision. I've done everything I can for you and Dad. It's time for you both to take responsibility for your lives. I love you, but I cannot sacrifice my future for the same cycle. I hope you understand." She reread the message several times, making sure it was clear but not cold. She didn't want to be harsh, but she knew she had to be firm. Chloe had to protect her future, and that meant saying goodbye to the past. With one final breath, She hit send. The moment she sent the message, Chloe felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't easy, but it was done. She had made her decision. She wasn't going back. For the first time in years, Chloe felt the weight lift off her shoulders. She had taken control of her life, and no matter what came next, she was ready to face it. Chloe sat at her desk, staring at her phone. The screen lit up again, this time with a call from her brother. She had expected this. It had been a few days since she sent the final message to her family, and now the emotional backlash was hitting her full force. She didn't answer. She didn't need to hear it again. The familiar guilt crept up her spine, but Chloe wasn't going to let it take over. She couldn't go back. Her brother had left another voicemail. This time he was desperate, his voice cracking with emotion. "Why are you doing this, Chloe?" he had said. "I need you. The restaurant's gone and everything is falling apart. You're the only one who can help us. Don't turn your back on the family." Chloe closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of his words. But this time, there was no more room for doubt. She had made the right choice. She wasn't going to be the one to fix everything again. Chloe stood up, pacing around her apartment. The weight of her decision still hung heavily in the air, but it wasn't the same kind of suffocating pressure it had once been. She felt a newfound strength inside her, something she had never realized she had before. She had spent so much of her life carrying the emotional and financial burden of her family, and now she was free. They had to face the consequences of their actions on their own. But even as she thought this, a small part of her still wondered if she was doing the right thing. The guilt, that nagging voice telling her that family should come first, tried to creep back in. Was it selfish to turn her back on them? Chloe had to remind herself that they had been manipulating her for years. They never asked her what she wanted, what she needed. It was always about them, and for the first time, she was choosing herself. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from her mother. Chloe's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this too, but it didn't make it any easier. She opened the message, her fingers trembling. "You're making a huge mistake, Chloe," her mother wrote. "You've always been the one we could count on. How could you walk away from us when we need you most? You'll regret this." Chloe put the phone down, trying to steady her breathing. She could feel the familiar tug of guilt, but she also knew that this was a test of whether she was going to go back to being the person she used to be, the one who put everyone else's needs above her own, the one who always said yes no matter how much it hurt. She wasn't that person anymore, and she wasn't going to let her mother's words pull her back into the cycle. Instead of responding, Chloe grabbed her jacket and left the apartment. She needed to clear her mind. The streets of Berlin were still unfamiliar enough that they felt like an escape. She walked through the city, the hum of activity around her, a reminder that life was continuing, moving forward, and she was part of it. Chloe didn't have to carry her family's problems anymore. She didn't have to be the one who saved everyone. As she walked, Chloe thought about the life she was building here. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. She had a job she loved, a home she was making for herself, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't worried about what was going wrong in everyone else's life. For the first time, she was focused on herself. The idea that she could keep her distance from the chaos, that she could keep choosing herself, felt like a revelation. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from her brother, this time full of accusations. "You've ruined everything. I can't believe you're doing this to us. You're choosing your life over your family. I don't know if I'll ever forgive you." Chloe read the text and then put the phone away, refusing to let his words get to her. He was angry. He had every right to be. But this wasn't her problem anymore. It was his. Chloe couldn't fix him, and she couldn't fix the mess her family had created. That wasn't her responsibility. By the time she returned to her apartment, she felt calm. There was no more second guessing. She was finally at peace with the decision she had made. She wasn't going to be the person her family wanted her to be anymore. She wasn't going to carry their burdens. She had a life to build, and she was going to build it without the weight of their expectations holding her back. Chloe's phone buzzed one more time as she sat down at her desk. It was her mother again. This time, the message was shorter. "You'll regret this. You'll see." Chloe didn't respond. She didn't need to. The guilt that had plagued her for so long was finally starting to fade. She wasn't abandoning her family. She was choosing herself, and for the first time, she felt like she was making the right choice. She put her phone down and looked out the window at the city stretching out before her. Berlin wasn't just a place anymore. It was her future, her freedom, and she was finally ready to embrace it fully. Chloe woke up to the soft hum of the city outside her window, the sound of Berlin stirring to life as the sun peeked through the blinds. She sat up in bed, feeling a quiet sense of contentment settle in her chest. The weeks since she made her decision to leave her family behind had been difficult, but now, for the first time, she felt truly at peace. Her life was her own, and it was a feeling she wasn't willing to give up. As she got ready for the day, Chloe reflected on how far she had come. When she first arrived in Berlin, she had been uncertain, torn between guilt and a desperate need for freedom. Now her job was going well. She was starting to form new connections, and most importantly, she had started to find pieces of herself that had long been buried under the weight of her family's expectations. Chloe smiled as she adjusted her scarf in the mirror. This was her new life, and she was finally learning to embrace it. But just as she was about to leave for work, her phone buzzed. The message was from her mother. Chloe hesitated before opening it, the old familiar feeling of dread creeping up her spine. She had barely heard from them since her decision, and part of her had hoped the silence meant they were beginning to respect her boundaries. But the message shattered that hope. It was short, but packed with emotion. "I can't believe you're doing this. Your father's health is declining, and you're still choosing your life over family." Chloe stood frozen, staring at the words. The guilt she had worked so hard to push away returned like a wave crashing over her. The thought of her father, someone she had always admired, sick and needing her, made her feel like she was losing something important. She stood there for a long moment, the phone in her hand, her heart pounding in her chest. But then, something inside her shifted. Chloe put the phone down gently, took a deep breath, and reminded herself of the choices she had made. She had been responsible for her family for far too long. She had put their needs above her own for years, and it had drained her. She couldn't go back to that life. Her father's health was a heartbreaking reality, but she knew that she wasn't abandoning him. She was giving herself the chance to heal and grow. Her family had to do the same. The day went on, and the message lingered in the back of Chloe's mind, but she focused on her work and the activities she had planned to explore Berlin. She spent her lunch break at a cafe she loved, looking out at the bustling street. The city felt alive, full of opportunity, and Chloe felt lucky to be there. For the first time in her life, she was living without the heavy weight of family expectations. She could breathe freely, and it felt like a luxury she had long been denied. Later that evening, Chloe returned to her apartment, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. As she settled in with a book, her phone buzzed once again. This time, it was a text from her brother. His words were sharp, almost accusing. "You're selfish, Chloe. You've abandoned the family in our time of need. You'll regret this." Chloe read the message, but it no longer had the same effect on her. The anger and accusations that once would have sent her into a spiral of guilt now seemed like empty words. She wasn't the same person she had been before. She had learned to put herself first, and though it hurt, she knew that her decision had been the right one. She wasn't going to let her brother's manipulations drag her back into the mess. The message from her brother was the final test, and Chloe passed it with quiet confidence. She put the phone down and returned to her book, allowing herself to savor the peace she had fought so hard to find. The next morning, Chloe sat by her window, sipping coffee and watching the city come to life. She thought about her family, about the decisions she had made, and how they had brought her to this point. The guilt, the anger, the hurt, it had all been part of the journey. But Chloe had come out the other side stronger. She had chosen herself, and that was something she would never apologize for. Looking out at the vibrant city, Chloe realized that this chapter of her life was just beginning. She had the freedom to make her own choices, to chase her dreams, and to live without the constant weight of other people's expectations. She smiled to herself and picked up her phone. Instead of responding to her family, she decided to send a message to herself. "I'm proud of you." She hit send, knowing that for the first time in her life, she was finally proud of the person she had become. Chloe's phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't from her family. It was a message from a colleague she'd recently met, suggesting they go out for drinks after work. Chloe smiled, typing back a quick response. "I'd love to." As she got ready to leave for the evening, Chloe thought about how far she had come. The road had been hard, but she was starting to see that it was worth it. She was living her life now, and the possibilities felt endless. And so, as Chloe headed out into the evening, she knew this was just the beginning. A new chapter was waiting, and she was ready to embrace it. Chloe's journey wasn't easy, but it was hers. She fought for her independence and found the strength to choose herself. If you've ever felt trapped by family expectations or the weight of others' needs, it's time to choose your own path. Remember, you deserve to live for yourself, to build your life on your terms. If you're ready to take control of your own story, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever made a tough decision for your own happiness? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay connected. Join me as I continue my journey. And let's support